welcome back to BlockTV, where every Sunday the crypto community receives a tweet in the form of a well-researched and thought-out Twitter thread by one of the top writers documenting the ecosystem. Of course, I'm talking about none other than my weekly guest, Nathaniel Whitmore, and his long-read Sunday Twitter column, the next line always makes me smile, so I keep saying it, a bit of the New Yorker for the crypto block news, if you may. Hello, Nathaniel. How are you?
Hey, how's it going? Yes. Good. How are you?
I'm well. And what a week this is going to be. I'm very glad to have you with us. You picked the 5 threads, so to speak, the 5 main long read Sunday. I want to start with, as you mentioned, number 5, the rise, and that's how you called it, the rise of state power and the looming state versus crypto. And I think very much the discussion around the sphere throughout this week. Quotes from within that debate that I found fascinating. This is on the heels of Binance and, as we mentioned before, the drum roll of that Facebook announcement. And you know what, pinpoint this discussion because I think it goes to the core of, I think, what the sphere will be after this week. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this week, you could honestly put these 5 threads in a blender and pick kind of any order to put them in because they all are part of the same conversation, which is what is crypto going to be? Is crypto going to be a tool for surveillance in the state? Is crypto going to be a tool for sovereignty and personal liberation? Is it going to be a little bit of both? What are the forces that are trying to co-opt or kind of pull it to one side or another? And so I wanted to kick this conversation off with a couple of folks who really pinned this issue down in the context of how crypto interacts with the state. So I'm always interested when 2 big thinkers independently talk about the same thing in a similar time period. And both Eric Meltzer, who's a venture capitalist at Primitive Ventures and who has spent a ton of time in China, that's kind of where his formative crypto years were, and Ryan Selkis, who's the founder of Masari and was at DCG and CoinDesk before that, okay. Both wrote about how crypto is inherently an anti-state technology. Right?
Or so we thought, or so we hoped, some of us. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, or at least a technology that has an intrinsic disempowerment of the state, right? The monopoly of printing money, for one, is no longer there. And so both of these guys wrote about how they had a slightly different angle. So for Eric, it was about how this idea that it's an inherently anti-state technology and what that means and why cryptocurrencies need to be prepared for state-level attacks. And then with Ryan, he kind of pulled out the trend line of states finally recognizing this. You have Japan, India proposing bans. You have the FATF travel rules coming up. You have a U.S. House bill that's kind of finally trying to recognize that the inherent that if Bitcoin wins, it threatens the U.S. dollar's global reserve status. So this is just frame setting for I think a lot of specific things that are happening now, but really important to always keep these ideas in the background as we're discussing basically everything happening in this industry.
Everything happening in this industry, and actually, you made a good point. Within this thread saying that, it also references what we heard about Binance this week. And, I'm interested with you. If Bitcoin, in the next, let's say, 3 to 4 years, and I'm talking about the incentive behind this ideology to begin with, or as it's mentioned there, if the US would ban Bitcoin, then other countries would have incentives to adopt it. That's one point that's being made in that thread. But if it loses its ability, to basically be a non-state or a global currency, then what is it then? What's the point? Do you know what I mean?
Well, the thing that's explicitly coming up in some of these essays is that you could functionally see a split of whitelisted and blacklisted Bitcoin addresses where it's co-opted a little, but not entirely, and it's used. Listen, it was designed not as a privacy technology. It is there's a transparent record of what's happened. In fact, part of its power is that everyone gets to see the system. And because of that, the possibility that it turns into something very different is there. And this is kind of getting at, another big thinker in this space, Catherine Wu, wrote about the protests in Hong Kong, right? So this is another interesting thing happening simultaneously. And they theoretically had nothing to do with Bitcoin and crypto, and they didn't. They were about a specific bill, a deportation bill, or an extradition bill, I guess, that would send Hong Kong residents back to China. But the interesting thing is, it was basically every political action that you see now becomes a story of surveillance and how people are getting around it. So you had people who were avoiding using their
Using
subway
the
cards.
subway in Hong Kong, because at the end of the day, that's a tracking system.
Mhm.
That's a tracking system, and it goes to the heart of the matter of what the people in Hong Kong, in the streets of Hong Kong, have been protesting for the past couple of weeks. And that, I mean, it's an extradition bill, but at the end of the day, it's that control that states like China would be doing with that technology, which they're already doing in China, essentially.
Yep, yep. It was interesting. I think this is another kind of relevant context. We don't have a graphic for this because it's from a week or two ago. But I think BlockTV, who was at Coinbase and who founded Earn, wrote a couple weeks ago. He wrote that basically every platform eventually ends up either decentralized or as a tool of the state. And his point was that if something is centralized, it will be used by the state. So the only option is to decentralize it and not give it that co-optable power. So I think we're seeing that play out in real life and in discussions as we speak.
No, it did entirely. Let's go to number 4, because again, that goes straight to the discussion. I think what things will be in Binance's, attempt to comply. But I'm going to let you explain it to us. So number 4, going to number 4 right now. Binance leaves the U.S. That's the thread apropos, as we heard. That Binance, or to quote CZ, this is a temporary thing, short pains for long gains. I think I'm ad-libbing his Twitter feed on that. And again, different people took different stances in this. One school of thought I'm reading you, said simply good riddance, shitcoin casino. Another argued that new compliant Binance would be stronger than ever. But some were not buying it. What was Lawmaster's argument for not buying it?
Okay, so first of all, just as background, what happened last week was that Binance announced a couple different things. First, they announced a regulated, approved exchange for the U.S. With partners here who had FinCEN jurisdiction and everything.
Yep.
And then second, they announced that starting in September, U.S. users would no longer be able to use Binance.com, which is obviously a huge thing. It's the biggest exchange in the world. It's the only place for liquidity for a lot of tokens. And so the point here that we're going to getting into is that there's a larger context of why this is happening. Binance has been very comfortable playing the regulatory arbitrage game and bouncing all over the world. So the fact that they're taking an active stance to deny US customers like this means that they are clearly feeling like the regulatory regime is tightening up here or solidifying in a way that they don't want to mess with. CZ is also notably unwilling to stand or come to the U.S. He turned down Justin Sun's invitation to join Warren Buffett.
I know. I actually have a newfound appreciation for him about that. But yes, he turned it down. I know.
So anyways, I think you've seen this for the last few weeks. Exchanges like Poloniex had a similar statement where they withdraw. Yep. And so basically what Larry was saying, Lawmaster is his handle, is his argument was that this has to be a serious issue for in terms of what Binance thinks the regulation is, because his argument was that so much of the value for that company comes from there's a ton of U.S. customers that are there. I can't remember the exact percentages, but it's a meaningful percentage of their traffic comes from the U.S. For a huge number of tokens that only are really traded on Binance. And its exchanges. And what's more, a huge part of Binance's business model is the BNB token, which is used to trade those things. And this really, kind of undercuts that. And you saw that BNB took a beating. Larry's point was that this is not just some clever financial move. This is clearly a reaction to larger issues. And I think it's just testament to, again, this larger conversation that we're having about how the regulatory regime is changing and how the state is sort of cracking back on these technologies.
Cracking back on these technologies, and I think, especially leading up to the G20 at the end of the month, or should we say the FATF coming out with some new guidelines rather than regulations, also within a week, that will probably be sweeping, and especially in the United States, will we comply there. But Binance is making a point to say, we don't want to do anything that, and I'm ad-libbing them, okay? We don't want to do anything that is not in compliance with your rules and regulations. So we're pulling ourselves up, but we're going to come back, according to what you guys want, which will probably be, and they're heavy on that, heavy on KYC. And that kind of, again, it's almost Binance becoming, what the regulators in the United States would like them to become, isn't it? Complying with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is, I mean, I guess it is worth noting at that point too, that there is a take that's a little less dystopian this that says, the state doesn't have to fail for these assets to be interesting. The things that they do in terms of allowing people to move money more easily is wonderful. And there's this world of totally compliant regulated use cases that are still great. And this is actually just, the world resetting itself. And of course, you're going to have a crazy period. Now, I think that that perspective would maybe ignore how they function as tools in places where regulation is not well intentioned. Right. That kind of the liberal democratic side of the world. But I don't know. I guess it is worth noting that there's a non-dystopian take on some of this as well, and that probably we're pretty inclined towards the dystopian in this community.
Entirely, amen to that. I think we're going to play bad cop, good cop, and you're clearly the good cop. Moving on to number 3, and I want to hear about these unpopular, so to speak, opinions. You, Nick Carter, unpopular Bitcoin opinions connect the dots with the state power, which again goes hand in hand with what we've been discussing right now, and that is, the idea of what is the meaning behind behind the sphere. He argued that it is not paradoxical to be glad to be rid of bad tokens and their exchange homes, while also being less than enthusiastic about the state power that compels such action. And state power is the talk of this thread. Why is he so unpopular, Nick Carter?
Oh, well, he's actually more popular than he thought. So Nick he made the classic blunder of saying one unpopular opinion. Lawyer Nelson Rosario did this a couple years ago and ended up with 1,000 or 2,000 likes or something like that. But it's a fun way to basically use the Twitter medium to start a bunch of conversations. And so right. Nick did that. He wrote, I think, about 50 quote unquote unpopular opinions. It turns out that they weren't necessarily unpopular. They were just things that it was almost like he was kind of liberating the Bitcoin community to talk about. And so
basically he's a true, anyway, that's disruption, finally. Yes, he riles us up, but continue, shoot.
Yeah, and Nick is one of those very intellectually authentic and honest people who is going to say what he thinks, kind of no matter who likes it or not. And so this point, though, I thought was relevant in this larger conversation. Almost gets into what we were just talking about, where he was basically saying, he's no fan. He's written extensively about how much the kind of casino, style exchanges around the world enabled people to kind of jump into crypto. Through these, tokens that were, just designed. Either they were totally far-fetched and they didn't have the right teams behind them, and there was no filtering mechanism, or in worst cases, they were actual outright scams. And there's kind of a spectrum in between. And so his point that he was trying to make is that it's okay to be glad that on the one hand, there is more rationality coming to the market, even if it's kind of through this, state's action, basically, while also not being happy that it had to be through the state. I think in Nick's ideal world, the market would have rejected this set of assets and we could have kind of cleaned up on our own.
I was about to say,
but it didn't. But, it was interesting because Nick, that wasn't the only thing he wrote this week about state power. In fact, Nick has been, kind of a third, I think, along with Eric and Ryan, of beating the drum this week in particular about crypto as an inherently, and Bitcoin as an inherently anti-state technology, and how regulators are recognizing that. So he had another whole thread on the topic that, again, is just, now that it has become clear that many governments do want to actually ban Bitcoin, we should focus on enhancing open access and free access, on-ramps and off-ramps that can't arbitrarily be shuttered. This is interesting. I think that it goes back to, this is another thing, approach like WePond, Eric was talking about as it relates to having cryptos be prepared for, kind of state action. This is another version of that. So again, what's notable to me is that there's this rising kind of undercurrent, that there's this conversation. And so, I think the way to almost look at this week is it's a back and forth between, on the one hand, this sentiment shift, and on the other hand, real things that are happening that seem to validate or add context to that, which I think gets us to the big thing.
Oh my
that
God, you're
is,
taking me to wait. That was my line because you just finished this line. And I was about to say this is a perfect segue for number two. Number two, because this is the moment of the week, will be the moment of the week. Number two, of course, Facebook Libra. Well, you know what? I'm going to just deem it the Facebook Libra announcement. But Facebook Libra partners. Let's talk about the first one because we're going to lead up to number five, and I'm going to let you pick up on that. Yes. First of all, Facebook coming up, but let's talk about the partners, so to speak.
Sure. So there's kind of two parts of this. Number two and number one this week, they're both about Facebook. It's the undeniable biggest story in the space, and kind of the number two is the actual news that we got, the specific information. And so first, I guess towards the end of the week, maybe Thursday, Facebook announced its first set of partners for Libra, who are the companies that were going to be spending $10 million plus to run one of their nodes. And the first ones that they announced were Uber, Visa, and PayPal. And so there was a lot of immediately there were two things that people thought, I think, and sometimes at the same time. One, those are some serious partners. This company's clearly not messing around. And two, it's like the oligarchy of existing financial and technology power is like the thing powering the decentralized network, right? And so then what happened next is that on Friday, Frank from the Block broke the full list of partners that they're announcing, presumably this week. And
presumably, it includes, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, huge array of different companies, as you can see here. So you've got the payments companies maybe that you'd expect, but you also have Spotify. You have not only Uber, but Lyft. You have a number of different investment firms. You have a handful of companies in the blockchain space.
MasterCard, Vodafone.
Yeah, I mean, it is, on the one hand, it is this massive, powerful set. So for that set of people who is excited about how this might expose more people to cryptocurrencies, you couldn't really ask for more. On the other hand, it really is like almost entirely a who's who of existing power, right?
Of existing power, and it leads to the question, because you look at those names, okay, and we keep, and granted, part of it is hype, and Libra is now not marketed, but let me rephrase this. Is this even a cryptocurrency? Will it be a cryptocurrency? Will it redefine what cryptocurrencies are? Because at the end of the day, there will not be very much anything decentralized about it, will there be?
I almost feel like there's two parts to this question. One is practically what does it look like from a technology standpoint? In what way is it a cryptocurrency? And this gets into a lot of questions of ideology around how decentralized cryptocurrency has to be, which is something that we've been, on forever, especially since EOS launched, right? What is sufficient decentralization, and so on and so forth. I almost feel like a second part of the question, which may be more impactful or may deterministic of the impact in the market, right, is whether Facebook calls it a cryptocurrency. Because if they do, and if they choose to brand around that, and that's their hook, it almost matters more than whatever arguments we have about whether 100 nodes is sufficiently decentralized or whose nodes matters. Because if Facebook comes out all guns blazing, and we don't know yet because we haven't really seen exactly, but if they say this is, a cryptocurrency project and they use those types of terminologies, that's, I think, the trigger for what a lot of people are hoping for, which is others to explore and come into this space. If they just say another mobile payment solution, that's very different.
That's very, very different. But at the end of the day, if they deem it a cryptocurrency, and I think that's a brilliant point, it becomes a cryptocurrency because of the mass reach, because of the sheer size of Facebook, which leads us to number 5. And again, and we keep mentioning this to our viewers all day today and most likely throughout the week, that Facebook will be the story of the week. There's a lot to unpack here. I'm reading you. A good starting point comes from Meltem, who jumped CNBC's closing bell to talk about Facebook Libra, then threaded a summary including why they're so interested. Okay, why? Hint, hint, apropos. Tell me about this thread.
Right. So for the reason that we chose this set, there was so much commentary around this. And in a lot of ways, what I'm interested in with Long Read Sunday is not just the news, but how the community is responding to the news.
How they're discussing it.
And like I said, people have different attitudes towards Facebook. Some think it's just a total co-option of the entire movement. Others are enthusiastic about the idea of kind of the mass expansion of cryptocurrencies and the on-ramp into the ideology of Bitcoin that it provides. A lot of people feel both, and they're not sure where it's going to land. But I think the one thing that everyone or most people tend to agree on is that there is an undercurrent of what this does from a data perspective that really, really matters, right? Facebook already has access to an incredible amount of information about us, about our behaviors, about our friends, our social graphs, and our interests. And this is, if nothing else, a massively new graph of information around the financial or the financial graph, what we spend money on. And that almost completes the loop from their marketing or from their market perspective of targeted advertising. You have not just who people are and what they might be interested in and what they've liked and what their friends like, but what they're actually spending money on. And as we've seen with Amazon's ability to immediately over the last 2 years come in and create a major challenge to the advertising duopoly of Facebook and Google. Amazon is now number 3 very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Having the financial graph of what people actually buy makes the social interest graph look like nothing in a lot of ways. So basically, this is kind of what Meltem is getting at, is that there is a huge, the part of the story to keep everyone's eyes on is what they do with the data, what protections there are for that data, how these node implementers or these node runners have access or don't to the data. And all of this is still a little unclear.
Incredibly unclear. Not only that, they're just now in the United States beginning to consider some sort of scrutiny towards these big companies for abuses of data, information, apropos which Europe has done a long while ago. But at the end of the day, I'm wondering with you, Nathaniel, because, okay, I mean, we all know, let's face it, it's going to be a huge monetization on everything that they own, which is our data. And okay, the regulator will step in the United States and here and there maybe slap them with some sort of like they've been doing to Google over in the EU, slap them with 3-4 billion worth of a fine, which at the end of the day we all know for Facebook or Google or those fang big monsters is nothing. So what are the stops in place? I know I keep playing the dystopian devil.
No. I mean, I think it's the right. Listen, the reason to start from the dystopian perspective and work backwards towards the optimistic is you're prepared, right? So I think, I think that fines are stupid and they're not going to work. Let's be clear about that, and everyone knows it. And I wish that we would all just acknowledge it. The next possible option is, the antitrust drums are beating and maybe they have to break things up. I think that part of why Facebook is doing this in this strategy and doing it, managed by an external foundation and showing all these partners is that we may scoff at the idea that this is decentralized, but you don't have a paradigm for regulators of seeing a company of Facebook's size and scale voluntarily giving up any power, right? So even the idea that somehow this is going to be managed by a set of external partners, I think, and I don't have a ton of direct information, but the folks that I know who are in Washington who are talking do say that regulators are actually impressed by this, that it's going to be governed by an independent foundation, at least as a starting point. So that's kind of interesting. I think that to take the optimistic point of view, which put as much faith in or not as you want, the opportunity to me is for, this is going to be a new legal entity, a new body built from the ground up. This is a chance for regulators to potentially have a seat at the table at the beginning for how those data policies are formed, rather than having to apply things later, rather than having to look at abuse. I feel like if we had an exciting and positive evolution of this, would be regulators, before the thing launches, actually having a crack at how this data is going to be used,
and
how
being part of the process. No, that's one way of looking at it. That definitely is one way of looking at
it. It almost for sure won't happen like that.
Yeah, but
because I don't. Maybe just because I don't know that the U.S. regulatory bodies are advanced enough to ask for it. It's not even so much that it's unreasonable or that they couldn't. It's like I don't know if they're prepared for that conversation.
I think that's very much a reasonable way of a way of looking at it. Are they knowledgeable enough or advanced enough to look at it that way? Finally, though, there's a tweet of the week that you want to share with us, isn't there?
Yeah. So I guess just to make clear that we're not too optimistic over here, I thought that of all the Facebook commentary, this is the one that really summed up, I think, what most people feel.
Please.
Even of us who are willing to give it a give them a chance to tell their story first. Can't wait for a cryptocurrency with the ethics of Uber, the censorship resistance of PayPal, and the centralization of Visa, all tied together under the proven privacy of Facebook. Uh, so Sarah David Lewis, who is one of the more essential follows, she runs the Open Privacy Foundation. She discovered a huge vulnerability in I think a Swiss open voting system earlier this year. Really, really brilliant. And this, I think, just I mean, how perfectly does this nail what people feel? Like we're having an active conversation of Twitter right now about whether banks or Facebook is trusted more, which shows how far down the ladder things are. So I think that people are going into what promises to be a monumental week
Monumental.
with a healthy dose of skepticism. And then from there, it's almost like everyone is skeptical. And the only question is whether you're skeptical cynical or skeptical optimistic. And as always for me, I'm going to be skeptical optimistic, but cynicism.
And I'm open to be surprised. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I'd very much be happy to be surprised. But as you mentioned, Nathaniel, very much Nathaniel Whitmore of the fabulous Long Read Sunday, as you mentioned, pivotal, monumental week. Thank you for starting it off with us. This was BlockTV. We'll be right back.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter